Hi, we're live. So, I've just been thinking, well, first off, let me show you my Christmassy hairstyle. It's very Christmassy. Okay. It's like a bowling ball or an ornament. I have to be careful how you turn my head. A lot of pins in there and whatnots. Anyway, that is not exactly what I wanted to talk about. Tonight, I want to talk about Syria. Again, yeah, I know. Oh, you're probably like, why are you talking about Syria so much? Well, my dad is Syrian Lebanese. And yes, he's Syrian, and yes, he's Lebanese, but it's also Syrian because it was Greater Syria. So I know in modern times people like to define it either as Lebanese or Syrian, but during that time when my great grandparents immigrated, it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. And I know a lot of people didn't like the Ottoman Empire, and towards the end, some bad things happened in the Ottoman Empire. But at the very beginning of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans were more tolerant as Muslims, and they were Muslims. I feel like right now it's real cool and hip to kind of hate on Muslims or to kind of not like Islam for some reason. I know that's real popular. It's not popular for me, and I'm kind of over it, and it's kind of political. It's so political. But I'm sort of over it because let me put um why I'm over it. So it's the politics everywhere, in every country, in every society. Right now in the US, I feel like people are glorifying Trump, okay? A lot of people who said that they would never vote for Trump, that were very staunchly independent, like recently have come out and said, oh, well, I voted for Trump and I was on the right side. But, you know, I'm not trying to compare Trump to like Assad. I'm not saying he's on that level, but it is a cautionary tale. What happened in Syria? Maybe that's a cautionary tale. And it looks like when you dig a little bit deeper into it, yeah, Russia had its hand in the pot in our election and kind of in Syria too. So, back in 2016, I'll tell you how I started hearing about how people thought Assad was the good guy. So I had my reservations. I had started my genealogy project back in 2016. I took a couple of DNA tests, and I really always wanted to know more because my grandpa knew that we were from a village that's in present day Syria, and I knew it was near the border of Lebanon called An al Shara. But I'd always had like this affinity for also Lebanese culture too. And like an interest in it. Like I just for some reason I always thought about it. And I remember when I read the Old Testament and it talked about Lebanon, for some reason it just felt familiar to me, just like Syria, like these stories. So I wanted to know more. I wanted to know, like, why on my DNA test did it say that 200 years ago my ancestors had lived in Lebanon and Aleppo and Damascus and the Rashid an al Shara Syria region? Like, why Lebanon? Because I didn't know about the stories of Lebanon. But when I started doing my DNA journey, I learned that some of my great great grandparents, like second great grandparents, had been born and it was in what is technically modern day Lebanon. Okay. So, and I also had third great grandparents born in Aleppo, Syria. And then I guess even farther back, it turns out some of them went to Lebanon, but previously they'd been more in what you would consider like some town in modern day central Syria. So, but at that time, it was all called Greater Syria, going back in time. Like all of these ideas of modern nation states, they didn't really exist back then. And yes, my ancestors were Christians, but the Christians lived with the Muslims and they lived in peace, especially in Syria, Lebanon. They lived in peace for thousands of years. And that's a story that I feel like in modern times, like there's a lot of villainization, like people are kind of hating on Arabs. And, I feel like in my grandpa's generation, that was kind of preached or something, like some people that wanted to be like, oh, well, the pan-Arab movement. And yes, technically, ethnically, Arabs are more centrally located to the Arabian Peninsula, but culturally and over time, the Arabic language has been dispersed to many neighboring countries. And it just came to be at the end of the day, as I discovered what was more behind it, there's certain people, they just don't like Muslims, okay? And I think that's what some of this is about. Some people, they just don't like Muslims, and they'll always say, well, Muslims persecute people. Well, other people persecute Muslims too. It goes both ways. And my ancestors were Christians. My great grandparents were Christians in Syria, okay? But I feel like a few years back when I started doing my genealogy project, and I was talking to some distant cousins, like third, fourth cousins, that actually some of them, I think one of them like kind of still lived in Damascus, but I didn't talk to them as much. But there was one lady, she'd been born in Damascus and she immigrated to the US. But they all seemed to think Assad was great. And I said, why? I'm hearing all these bad things about why people had to become refugees and leave Syria, and how buildings were being bombed and all this horrible stuff, and suppression of freedom of speech. But they kept saying, like, just parroting probably what they had always heard, because I guess if you grow up in Syria, and from what I heard, Assad and his father, they ruled that country with an iron fist. And in school, in society, you kind of couldn't say anything bad about Assad. That it wasn't allowed. You weren't allowed to speak out about him at all. And some people might be like, oh, you're making like a big parallel, saying that, oh, Trump could be like that. But Trump doesn't like people to talk bad about him. And I'm not saying that we're going to go down that route, but I do find it awful scary that Donald Trump like doesn't really sometimes support freedom of speech. And look at what we discovered recently about Syria, that they had mass graves where they basically unalived people that just spoke out against the government. That's pretty scary. And that's happened in Iran too, in many incantations. So just because a leader is more Western and, oh, they seem more tolerant, are they really? Like, look, I hope that the new government in Syria will do the right thing and they'll be better. And there are some questions and doubts, but I think we should let them try and prove themselves. I do. Because once we've unearthed what happened with Assad, it's not good. And maybe Assad was put into this position. Maybe his mom, I've heard some people say, oh, well, his mom groomed him because his older brother passed away in the car accident and he wasn't destined to rule Syria. And he was a soft-spoken ophthalmologist, eye doctor, and he wasn't destined to do these things, but he did them, okay? He killed people. He unalived people. Like, there was no freedom of speech in Syria. He was a dictator, pure and simple. And to hear that many, like, when you start hearing the stories, and some people might be like, well, that's fake news, that's made up. It's not. They're bringing in forensic scientists, people that deal with like crime, different crime sites with like people that have been buried, like killed. They're bringing in experts. And they're going to do DNA research to find out who and how they're related to people. And a lot of estimates don't look good. Like, the estimates look like pretty much everybody that disappeared during the years from like 2011 until, I don't know, a few years ago, or maybe more recently. A lot of them might be in those mass graves. And this is on the level of what happened during the Holocaust. This is really bad. But Assad just did this to his own people because he cared. He wanted to stay in power that bad. He wanted to be in power. He did not care about freedom of speech. Oh, what? He seems more tolerant. He seems more Western. And then I know some people are going to say, oh, but how can you say this about him? Like, he was so soft-spoken. But that's where I began to realize, just because some people, even if when you're doing genealogy and like you talk to somebody who might be a distant relative and they like somebody, you have to question it. And I started looking deeper into it. And it goes back to Russia. And I'm not making Russia out to be the bad boogie boy, because I don't think that. But I do think everything that kind of is related to Putin isn't necessarily good. Okay. So, yeah, they did meddle in our election a little bit in 2016. I know some people are like, no, they didn't. But yes, they did. How come all around that time you have Putin in Syria propping up Assad, who's a dictator, and Putin didn't do that out of the kindness of his own heart. Like, Putin was like doing all this PR, like, I'm the savior of the Christians in Syria. He wasn't, okay? He wasn't the savior of the Christians. And then Assad saying, look, I'm going to help protect all the minorities, and if somebody else was in power, they would be unalived. But there were Christian people that spoke out against Assad too. It wasn't just Muslims, okay? And I know Assad does come from a minority background, the Alawites, and I've learned a little bit about them, and they tend to be more of a mystic type religion that sort of was affiliated with Islam, but they're not exactly Muslim. It seems like they retain some of the older pagan polytheistic beliefs that were around in Syria before Judaism or Christianity or Islam, like before the Abrahamic religions, really. So yeah, I know some people are going to say, oh, but the Alawites are being like protected under Assad and the Ba'ath Party. But, just because somebody says they're protecting minorities, that doesn't mean that they're a kind person. That doesn't mean that they're a good person. They might seem like, oh, they're so kind, they're so good. Well, this was also the problem with Raza Pahlavi in Iran. Like, he was like, oh, I'm Western, look at me, I'm tolerant. But if you spoke out against him, you would end up in Evin prison. So I'm not saying that these new regimes are good, but I'm hoping for Syria it's different. But right now, like, everybody's telling us what is going to happen to Syria. Do they know yet? Do they have a crystal ball? They don't know Syrian people, because I believe that Syrian people want better than that for themselves. I don't think they want a dictator. I don't think they want to be ruled by a dictator. Some people just think, oh, that's what Syrians want, and they're just going to end up like Afghanistan. Not that Afghani people wanted that either. But just, it's kind of, a lot of it's a lie. It's just a lie, like, to make it seem like, well, Syrian, it's just like Iran, or it's just like Afghanistan. And a lot of these people don't really know anything about Syrian people, culture, customs. They're just making assumptions. And a lot of this goes back to, yeah, Assad was in power, but I think he knew he should have stepped down. I think he knew he was being propped up by Russia. And recently, like, when I started learning about, like, how it was a few years back, actually, how bad, these things weren't good in Syria, but I learned how bad it truly was, and how the Russians were propping them up, and how they would target, like, schools and hospitals, kind of like what they're doing in the Ukraine. And now, like, look at anybody in Russia, if they don't agree with the war in the Ukraine, like, not allowed, no freedom of speech, similar idea. I don't know. I think Russian people are amazing, but everything kind of connected to Putin isn't so good. He's a dictator too, and he loves to do PR. Assad loves to do PR. They're all about my image. Look at my image. I'm a good guy. Oh, the West is being kind of mean to us. And, maybe Assad maybe he could have done the right thing, but I think he didn't want to allow freedom of speech in his country. I think he either got caught up in the machine of, like, lusting after power and wanting to suppress any freedom of speech, like, not make any concessions, or he actually really enjoyed it. I don't know. I don't know the man. Like, I don't know what's in his head. But rather than speculate, and here's another fun thing. A lot of American conservatives, they're like, oh, you changed your mind on Syria. How could you? Like, You should just know, like, if you didn't support like Assad, like you're on the side of like fruitcakery, and but then it's okay for conservatives to change their mind all the time. I'm so through with that. I'm so through with anything that seems kind of influenced by Russia, which, let's be honest, Trumpy kind of is. Um, they had bots that got involved in our election. They were propping up dictators in Syria. They did it in. They are trying to do that in the Ukraine, trying to take over the Ukraine's government. I mean, think about it. And then WikiLeaks too. Like, I know like Snowden was kind of heralded as a civil rights hero, blah blah blah. But isn't that weird how he got asylum in Russia? I mean, a lot of it just seems like it's kind of a Russian agenda. Like, I hate to say it, like I'm not all Cold War because I don't believe in Cold War politic, but it does look like at the end of the day, a lot of it is Russia wants to have a big influence in, and don't forget this. Here's another thing that happened like back in 2010 where there was a cell of Russians who were pretending to be American and Canadian, and they were pretending to be born in the US under assumed identities, like to try and change foreign policy to embed in themselves and engender themselves. So yeah, it seems like Russia had its hand in a lot of pots. It had its hand in Syria. It didn't really care what happened to the Syrian people, but they would do PR to look good. But once, Russia's stretched a little thin now. That's why they backed out of Syria, because Assad, he wanted them to help him. He was begging hard, and apparently it was a no. It was a hard no. But they're like, oh, for now you can have asylum in Russia. Like, we'll see how long that lasts. I don't know. I feel like Putin's not a super loyal guy. Like, I'm sure if anything happens, I mean, but at the end of the day, I don't know what to say. I do think, should have Assad stepped down in 2011? Probably. He wasn't going to. And hopefully the new government will be better. But rather than speculate and wonder, maybe we should read some news articles like I did the other Friday night. I'm going to share some news articles. So let me start with the first one. One of Assad's mass graves found with as many as 100,000 bodies. But justice for the victims of Assad's regime will be slow. A mound of dirt blocks the road to a walled compound on the outskirts of Al-Qatafa, a town around 30 kilometers north of Damascus, the Syrian capital. It is silent, save for the occasional bark of two stray dogs and a faint buzz of power lines running over the compound. Breeze block walls enclose the area roughly the size of 2 football fields. For more than a decade, Bashar al-Assad's army turned this wasteland into a mass grave, believed by Syria's new rulers to be of his largest. For years, the earth movers would arrive late at night, followed by refrigerated trucks packed with bodies, locals said. Initially, the graves were not deep enough. Stray dogs would burrow into the dirt and pull out corpses. Mr. Assad's soldiers were ordered to dig deeper. And you know what's really gross? I was watching a video about this actually, where they were talking to some of the local people, and one man said he recognized this woman that was wearing like her gym outfit, like she used to go to the gym, and he saw her frozen together with other people, and then they were talking about how there were children, and this was barbaric. This wasn't some like man that was just like, oh, I just am trying to protect like the Christians and the Alawites. No, he killed anybody who didn't agree with him. Oh, you question that he's not a god? Well, death for you. Like, and Reza Shah Pahlavi, he may have also portrayed himself as Western, but he did the same ding dong thing. He wasn't that much better the current regime in Iran. And if you didn't agree with him, you ended up in Evin prison. Well, and a lot of those people ended up dead, same like Syria. Until a week ago, this was one of the most sensitive areas in Syria, a garrison town where stopping your car in the wrong place could mean you being arrested. Locals kept silent, paralyzed by fear. Whatever they sent me, I was supposed to bury, said Haj al Salah, Saleh, um, a former mayor of the town who still lives there. He resigned in 2012 and was then briefly detained by the authorities after refusing to follow orders to construct a mass grave. So he didn't want to do it. Like he was like, you know what? I don't want to. I don't want to like participate in this. And he got in trouble for it. So it's not like he had the freedom of speech to be like, oh, I'd rather not do this. I'd rather just, do my own thing. No, he didn't. He didn't have the freedom of speech to decide that. But the regime found others who were more willing. It was the early years of Syria's civil war, and Mr. Assad's grip was tightening. Prisons were overflowing, and the regime turned to increasingly brutal methods to suppress dissent. Yeah, it was pretty bad. Really, really bad. You think this is good? It's not. But the regime found others more willing. At the grave of the compound stands a man who is desperately searching for his uncle, Mustafa al Atki, who has been missing since 2015. As he walks across the dusty ground, he bursts into tears. It's almost impossible to know how many people are buried in this grave or who they are. Another former mayor of the town estimates that the number could be over 100,000. If that figure is even close to accurate, this could be the largest mass grave in the world. In recent years, human rights organizations have used satellite imagery to determine that there was a mass grave on the outskirts of Al Khatafa. They could not say anything definitive about the number of bodies it contained. In the years that followed, the regime attempted to cover its tracks. Residents described trucks that would arrive to exhume bodies, moving perhaps thousands elsewhere. A foul stench would engulf the town as the trucks unearthed the graves. Everyone in town knew what they were doing, says a farmer who lived there. Okay, you know what this sounds like? And you know exactly what this is like? This is like when the German people knew what the Nazis were doing to the Jews in those concentration camps. And everybody knew about it. But apparently they were scared, but nobody, like, I guess, because just like with the Nazis, just like with Assad, if you were to speak out, I think you would not have a good consequence. So I don't know what more they could have done, because that one mayor who didn't want to do a mass grave, it sounds like he got in trouble for not going along with the program. It's pretty sick. This is bad. This is not good, okay? So the minute you say, oh, well, Assad was more tolerant, really? He killed anybody who didn't agree with him. In prison for you. And then, oh, overflow of prison. I read some stories about how these people were unalived, and it wasn't nice. Even before the Civil War, Al Khatafa was heavily militarized and home to several army units. Multiple local officials state that Syria's army, 3rd Division, one of the most loyal to the regime, oversaw the gravesite. What started with a few political prisoners became an industrialized pit for disposing of the regime's opponents. And it wasn't just adults. There were children that were connected to people that protested. Local officials in Al Khatafa named several senior military officers from the former regime who they believe were involved in the administration of the gravesite. One is an Alawite general from the city of Tartus, an area that has produced many of Assad's most loyal cadres. The Economist called a telephone number that is listed for the general in an online sanctions database. An unknown man answered and denied that he was the man named. He gave himself two different names in the course of the conversation, neither the one listed in the database. We were unable to confirm his identity. He said that he was in Jable, Latakia, near Latakia. Many of the regime's most senior officials fled to Moscow with Assad. So I guess some of his senior officials got out because he left his maternal cousins behind. But others are still thought to be in Syria, hiding out in Alawite villages throughout the coastal areas, including Latakia. Everyone in El Katafa seems to have known that something horrifying was going on, but to say anything was to risk ending up in the grave. So far, there has been no talk from those now in charge of Syria of exhumation and forensic testing to confirm the scale of the atrocity. The residents of El Katafa are enraged. They are desperate for the world to know what happened in their town. After more than a decade of war, millions of Syrians have missing relatives. A handful of survivors have limped out of the regime's prisons in recent weeks, but for many, the only hope for answers lies in the mass graves being discovered across the country. Ali Shwat is a farmer in Al Katafa and who worked just a few hundred meters from the grave site for over a decade. The mother of the dead person can sleep, he says, but the mother of the missing son never will. I mean, it's pretty bad. So, yeah, it's horrible. People, they trivialize this. They're like, well, there's just a lot of trivialization. I think of everything that's going on in Syria, and well, people in the know don't, but yeah, some people are like, oh, it's just another horrible day in the Middle East, and yeah, it's pretty bad. I there's no way around it, right? There just isn't. I don't know if that worked. I don't think that worked. Try doing it another way. Okay, I'm gonna try just sharing it. I said I haven't done this in a long time, so I feel a little busty. Let's see. U.S. diplomats meet Syrian opposition leader in Damascus. So this is our next news story on Axios. Axios. Top State Department officials have visited Damascus on Friday and met the leader of the opposition group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, Ahmad al-Shara. U.S. officials say. Why it matters. It was the first public meeting between U.S. diplomats and al-Shara, who led the Syrian revolution that toppled the Assad regime. The U.S., by the way, I think his family's from the Golan Heights region. And it's interesting too because the way that it's spelled is kind of like that town where my great grandparents were from on Al Shara. So yeah, that's interesting. Like I'm sure there's a difference because Arabic's transliterated differently in English, but I just thought that was interesting. The U.S. government has designated al-Shara, who is also known as Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, as a terrorist and has a 10 million bounty on him. So I guess in the past, but I heard that they were going to be getting rid of this bounty on him. A U.S. official said the meeting with al-Shara was good and productive. Driving the news, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Barbara Leaf, said al-Shara committed to not allowing terror groups to operate in Syria and threaten the U.S. or neighboring countries. Leaf said that as a result, the U.S. made clear it won't pursue. Okay, so this is where they're talking about dropping the $10 million bounty on him, a reward for justice on al-Shara. Because, I mean, he has said, I know in the past, I'm not saying like what he was connected to was good, because it was all kinds of problematic. Like, I'm sorry, like being connected to Al-Qaeda, that's not a good thing. You can't paint it anyway, but he says that he's broken away from this group. That's what he claims anyway. And as of right now, he's saying all the right things. US officials and other officials are meeting with him, and they're gonna say, like, let's work with him for now. I mean, you kind of have to, right? Because who else are they going to work with? I'm hoping that what he says is going to happen, like that he will respect the rights of everybody. I hope that can happen, but we're going to have to see what happens. But after what Assad did, I don't know what other option you have, because Assad did bad stuff. So we have to give Syria an opportunity to rebuild itself. So you might not like him and his past, but I don't have anything against him personally, because you know what? If he says that he wants to do the right thing, we have to give him a chance. If he does the wrong thing, then we can say he lied. You know, you kind of have to give people a chance. You can't just be like, oh, like they're bad no matter what. Things aren't black and white all the time. Plus, Syria has a right to self-determination. Like, the US can have diplomatic relations with them, but you don't get to invade them and determine what their government is. You know, that's not right. Well, they need to figure it out themselves. Leaf said that as a result, the US made clear it won't pursue the $10 million bounty. Leaf said that she had a good, thorough-going discussion with al-Shara on a range of regional issues as well as the domestic scene. I heard him on priorities, which are very much rooted in getting Syria on the road to economic recovery, which, yeah, Syria needs that. I hope for the Syrian people, because the Syrian people are great. Love Syrian people. Like, that's my roots, and you just don't know if you say bad things about Syrians. You just can't. Anyway, that's what I say. I heard him on his priorities, so she says she thinks he's on the right way. Leaf said lifting the bounty is a policy decision in the interest of beginning a discussion with HTS. If we are having a discussion, it is incoherent to have a bounty on his head. See, that's the thing. You have to be able, like when a new leader comes in, you might not like what their past was, and it might not be perfect, but you're going to have to accept it, because at the end of the day, this is Syria's choice, and this is how Syria's going forward. And I'm hoping, though, that they have an election. I hope they can do that. It might take a long time before they can get there, but hopefully that's the way that they're headed. The U.S. delegation arrived in Damascus on Friday morning, local time, under heavy security, U.S. officials said. It was the first visit by the State Department officials in Syria in more than a decade. See, we haven't even our officials haven't even been having a diplomatic relationship with Syria, so this has got to be a step in the right direction. The trip was part of the resumption of U.S. diplomatic engagement with the transitional government in Syria after the toppling of the Assad regime. Leaf said al-Shara came across as pragmatic and expressed moderate positions on women's rights. She stressed that it was a good first meeting, but we will judge by deeds and not by words only. And then here's a zoom in. It says the U.S. delegation was led by Assistant Secretary of State for the Near Eastern Affairs, Barbara Leaf. She was accompanied by former U.S. envoy to Syria, Daniel Rubenstein, who will stay in Syria as the top U.S. diplomat on the ground. The State Department envoy for hostage affairs, Roger Carstens, also joined the delegation. One of the key issues the delegation discussed with al-Shara and other members of the transitional Syrian government was the search for missing U.S. journalist Austin Tice. And this doesn't sound good. I know they've been looking for Austin Tice, and they were looking for him like in the prison, but some people were saying it just does not look. I mean, I hope he turns up, but a lot of people disappeared under Assad. It's kind of scary. The U.S. delegation was holding talks in Damascus. U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, announced that it conducted an airstrike on Thursday targeting ISIS leader in Syria, Abu Yusuf. 2 ISIS operatives were killed, including Yusuf, CENTCOM said. CENTCOM said the strike, so this just kind of goes on. And then I guess it goes deeper, scoop, the top State Department official visits Syria. And yeah, it just kind of goes on and on. A little bit more in that one. Okay. Which ones did I read already? Let me see. So I'm going to share another news article. Like we're going to, because this is what I like to do. Like I like reading the news, and I feel like reading the news rather than just speculating and be like, they said, he said, this is what we think. Let's read the news stories together, and we can learn together, and it's very interesting because I feel like I'm learning new things all the time, and it's so fascinating to see how this will unfold. Okay. Did I read this one already? I'm trying to think. I don't think I read this one yet. Okay. The U.S. has scraped the 10, and this is a BBC article, has scraped a 10 million, 7.9 billion pound reward for the arrest of Syria's de facto leader, Ahmed al-Shara, following meetings between senior diplomats and representatives of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. I know they're called HTS, but I keep thinking about like a BTS or something like a Korean K-pop band. I don't know why. I'm like, I just could see, I know that sounds so funny, but every time I hear HTS, I keep thinking like there's going to be like these cute K-pop guys that are going to come out and sing. Even though I know that's not what HTS is. I don't know why that just stuck in my mind. I'm like, because we call everything an acronym nowadays. HTS. I don't know. That's what they're called, I guess. No, it is what they're called. Assistant Secretary of State Barbara Leaf said the discussion with Shara was very productive, and he came across as pragmatic, which was what the other article was stating. The U.S. delegation arrived in the capital, Damascus, after HTS overthrew Bashar al-Assad's regime less than a fortnight ago. Fortnight is a British English word for a 2-week period, which used to be used in the U.S., but fortnight is used in the U.K., but not so much in America nowadays. Washington still designates it as a terrorist group. A State Department spokesperson confirmed that the diplomats discussed transition principles supported by the U.S. regional events and the need to fight against IS. Or IS, I guess, IS. Because it sounds like, I don't know, if he broke away from this group, let's give him a chance. Like, if it turns out he's not what he says he is and he's a noodle, then yeah. But yeah, when a new government comes into power, you have to work with them and you have to hope for the best. I mean, maybe he's just a PR genius. Maybe he just has rebranded himself like amazingly. But I don't know. I guess only time will tell. The spokesperson also said officials were seeking further information on American citizens who disappeared under Assad's regime, including journalist Austin Tice, who was abducted in Damascus in 2012, a psychotherapist Majid Kamal Maz, who disappeared in 2017, a U.S. Embassy spokesperson earlier said a news conference involving Ms. Leaf had been canceled due to security concerns. I guess I have to be careful. That doesn't sound good, but considering the situation. However, during later briefings, Leaf denied that, insisting street celebrations were the cause of the delay. So I guess she's denying what the state's U.S. Embassy spokesperson said. That's interesting. The visit is the first formal American diplomatic appearance in Damascus in more than a decade. I mean, that's a good sign, right? Because the U.S. hasn't had a diplomatic relationship with Syria since before 2012, really. I mean, what kind of diplomatic relationship could you have with a country that suppresses freedom of speech? I know a lot of people don't want to let go of the fact that Assad loved propaganda and he loved having social media people that spin a good story about him. Did I talk about the food documentary the other day? It was recommended to me. It was so interesting. It was all about like different street foods and family foods in Syrian households, and very beautiful documentary, by the way. Like, I think the man who that vlogged it, I don't think he's the problem, but I do think like the people who facilitated like certain cameos with, I don't know, talking about, oh my gosh, look how they overcame this. Look how the Assad regime overcame this. And look what happened to all these hotels because of the civil war, and how, oh no, Assad was protecting everybody. I think it didn't paint an exactly true picture, I think it was very pro Assad, but maybe it was one of his last ditch efforts to try and make it look like Syria was going forward and that he was in control. I don't know. Like, he loved PR, he loved propaganda. He invited Good Morning America, a news program in the U.S., to come to Syria back in 2007 and 8, and he did interviews and he had like different cameos with restaurants. Like, I think that was kind of the way, that was one of their little PR things. So, but the timing was weird because that YouTube video was released 3 months ago, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird. And now like Assad's gone. That's kind of weird timing. A U.S. Embassy spokesperson earlier said a news conference involving Ms. Leaf had been canceled due to the security concerns. It's a further sign of a dramatic shift underway in Syria since the ousting of Assad, and the speed of efforts by the U.S. and Europe, also leaning on Arab countries to try and influence its emerging governance. A visit follows those delegations in recent days from the UN and other countries, including the UK, France. The delegation of senior officials includes Barbara Leaf, Roger Cranston's, who is a U.S. President Joe Biden's hostage envoy, Daniel Rubenstein, a senior advisor to, and it just goes on. So anyway, I'm going to take myself out of all the sharing. Mostly, I just wanted to, I guess, touch upon how I think it's just really interesting. Okay, I just find this very fascinating, like the times we live in and what's happening in the world. Like, I am just so curious to see how this all plays out in the end, Very fascinating times. And I want to talk more about Syria in the future because it's going to continue to be a big news story. And I also want to talk about this. I wanted to talk about this a little bit. Politics, okay? Because I know I'm mostly like sharing news stories about Syria, but it ties into America too. It ties into every country. Politics. Everybody has a political view, okay? That's never going to end. There's always going to be political friction. There's always going to be political turmoil. Things are always going to be political. But I do believe that you need to stop treating any leader like a god. And I'm seeing this kind of in the US too. Like, some people, like a lot of conservatives, you complain about how Donald Trump was like a god. Oh, not Donald Trump, but like Barack Obama, how liberals treated Barack Obama like a god and they acted like he could do no wrong. But a lot of conservatives have done the same thing with Donald Trump recently. And at the end of the day, I do think that Donald Trump's kind of problematic. I don't like his policies. When did immigration, like unauthorized, like undocumented immigration, become our biggest like concern? Because I still don't believe to this day that's their biggest concern. And just all the different things that they kept throwing out there was just like a distraction campaign. And I just don't think Joe Biden was the best president. He really wasn't. I mean, the economy really wasn't that great under him. There were a lot of issues, but I don't see how Trump coming in and saying he's going to raise tariffs on every country outside of the US that's importing things into the US is going to help us. Like he's saying that's going to help our economy, because it just isn't. And if you read news articles about it, the prognostication has been the economy will probably be worse under Trump than it would have been under Kamala Harris. And I'm not saying the economy has been thriving right now, but it's just like people who act like one politician is just like a god and they're our savior and they're the best. Well, Trump might not be on the level of Assad, but that just goes to show you the way that people act about Trump and how they buy his hats and how they buy his flags and they put his memorabilia on their car. That's a cult too. You're treating Trump like a god. And if people can do that in the US, where we still have free speech, I can see how ramped up that got in Syria, where there was no freedom of speech. Okay, so what? Like women can wear like a short skirt or they can listen to hip hop music. That's all fine and dandy, but the minute you like students question something that is happening under the Assad regime and they disappear because they had a protest, like no freedom of speech, that's kind of scary. And I just hope Americans or Europeans or anybody from any country where you still have nominal freedom of speech, like kind of opens your eyes and realize, maybe we shouldn't like treat politicians like gods. And also too, maybe we shouldn't be so divided anymore. Like all these people that like their whole life is politics. And for years, like I used to do like a podcast with somebody who like everything was political for this person and a certain type of political. And I knew like deep down, if you didn't agree with their certain agenda, that you just were not one of the enlightened ones. You weren't one of the cool ones. And I always knew that in the back of my mind, but I kept wanting to try and do these live streams with her. And it just was not working because I always felt like, this is kind of weird. Like she always lets me know she does not agree with me on so many things. And it always put me in like kind of this awkward situation. And I also just I didn't think the politics are always so necessary. Like I totally think like you could live your life happily without telling everybody your political view. It's fine if you want to, but I think we've gotten to an unhealthy place where people aren't as religious anymore. So now they use like politics or social movements like in lieu of religion. And I don't know why you need to tell everybody like what your political view is all the time and preach to the masses like they need to think this way or there's something wrong with them. I mean, this is what dictators do. And then be surprised that people aren't interested in that. But there's always going to be people who follow a dictator or people who follow the cult of celebrity. And I just think it's time to get past it. I'm not going to live my life based on politics. Like I will still vote in American elections and I'm very happy to live in the US where we have freedom of speech. But I really will never define my life by a political party. I don't consider myself either conservative or liberal. And I'm tired of the people on both sides who act so righteous. And yes, they do. And I know that like the conservatives like to pretend that liberals act more righteous than they do, but no, believe me, I've seen the dark side of the moon and it's not enlightening. And it's nothing that makes you like think, wow, You say, like, you think things about people like that, nobody's ever going to want to follow your like agenda. I can tell you that right now. And nobody's going to think like, wow, you're an admirable person because you think and talk about people like that. They're just not going to, okay? They're just not going to. So at the end of the day, politics is just not healthy. Like, it's okay to vote. It's okay to have like freedom of speech, but to be so divided with our common man like we are in the US today, I'm so over it. Stop blocking people. Stop making your whole life about politics. Like, look what happened in countries with a real dictator. I mean, I just hope in the US people don't just blindly follow a politician just because he told them that he was going to make something great again. Because most likely, you need to make your own life great. Stop following a politician. I'm just saying. Like, open your eyes and don't be so taken in. Good night.